Justice did exactly what it was supposed to do. The case was closed. The decision was final. And yet, long after the verdict, something refused to settle. Not doubt about the process. Not confusion about the outcome. But questions that no ruling could answer. This story isn't about what justice decided. It's about what it deliberately left behind. Once the initial weight of the verdict settled, the story did not move forward the way most people expect it to. There was no dramatic shift, no sudden clarity, no emotional release that marked a clean transition from uncertainty to acceptance. Instead, the moment stretched quietly, as if time itself hesitated to acknowledge that the case was officially over. The courtroom had fulfilled its role. Every step taken according to procedure, every requirement met without deviation. On paper, nothing remained unresolved. Yet beneath that surface of order, a different process had begun. One that did not belong to the system, but to those who witnessed its conclusion. People left with a sense that something had been decided, but not something they could easily name. It wasn't disagreement with the outcome, nor suspicion toward the process. It was the realization that justice, once delivered, does not always carry meaning with it. Meaning has to be constructed afterward, slowly and often without guidance. As days passed, the details of the case began to blur, while the feeling it left behind became more distinct. The absence of emotional resolution did not fade. It settled. Conversations about the case became quieter, more careful, stripped of certainty. People found themselves explaining not what happened, but how it felt to accept that it had ended without providing relief. This discomfort did not signal failure. It signaled a boundary. Justice had reached the edge of its responsibility and stopped. What followed was no longer institutional. It was personal. Each observer carried the same outcome, but interpreted it differently, shaped by expectation, experience, and belief. The case no longer belonged to the courtroom. It existed in memory, in thought, in the uneasy space between closure and understanding. That space was not empty. It was active, demanding reflection without offering direction. And in that space, a difficult realization began to form. Justice can close a case without closing the questions attached to it. The system does not promise emotional alignment, only resolution. Everything beyond that belongs to those who must live with the result. This was where the story truly began, not with a crime or a ruling, but with the moment people recognize that the end of a case is not the end of its impact, and that some questions persist, precisely because justice has already done all it was designed to do. In the days that followed, what stood out most was not outrage or debate, but restraint. A quiet hesitation that settled over conversations whenever the case was mentioned. People spoke carefully, as if raising their voices might oversimplify something that refused to be reduced. There were no heated arguments, no firm declarations about right or wrong, only pauses where certainty was expected to exist. It became clear that silence was not avoidance. It was processing. The verdict had answered the legal question, but it had also introduced a psychological distance that words struggled to cross. Many felt that speaking too confidently would betray the complexity they sensed beneath the surface. The case did not invite commentary. It discouraged it. In offices, homes, and private conversations, people referenced it briefly, then moved on, not because it lacked importance, But because it demanded more thought than most were prepared to offer in passing, this reluctance revealed something subtle about how justice is absorbed. When outcomes feel emotionally complete, discussion flows easily. When they do not, silence becomes a form of respect, a recognition that immediate interpretation might distort rather than clarify. The case lingered in this quiet state, neither dismissed nor dissected, existing in the background of thought without resolution. Over time, people noticed that the absence of conversation did not weaken the case's impact. It deepened it. The lack of shared narrative forced individuals to confront their own reactions without reinforcement or contradiction. Each person carried the outcome alone, shaped by personal values rather than collective agreement. This isolation made the experience heavier but also more honest. Without a dominant interpretation to lean on, reflection became unavoidable. The case demonstrated that silence can be more demanding than debate, requiring patience, self-examination, and tolerance for uncertainty. It challenged the expectation that every decision must be explained, discussed, and resolved publicly. Instead, it suggested that some outcomes need space rather than commentary, time rather than reaction. In that space, meaning did not arrive quickly, but it began to take form, quietly and unevenly, reminding those who encountered it that understanding often develops not through conversation, but through the moments when conversation stops. As the initial quiet gave way to distance, the silence surrounding the case began to transform into something more demanding, an internal dialogue that surfaced unexpectedly and without structure. People noticed it during ordinary moments, while reading unrelated news, hearing another verdict announced, or forming quick opinions about events that seemed simpler by comparison. The case no longer needed to be mentioned to be present. It had become a reference point within thought itself. Questions emerged not as accusations, but as interruptions. Why did this outcome feel heavier than others? Why did acceptance come so easily on the surface, yet resist settling internally? The absence of clear emotional cues forced individuals to examine their own expectations rather than the decision itself. Without outrage to react to or certainty to cling to, attention turned inward. People realized how often they relied on collective interpretation to validate their responses, and how exposed they felt when that validation was missing. The case created a rare condition where reflection could not be outsourced. Each person was left alone with the same conclusion, yet arrived at different meanings. This divergence did not fracture trust in the system. It complicated it. Trust remained, but it was no longer effortless. It required acknowledgement of limits, of the difference between deciding and understanding. Over time, the questions became less about what the court should have done and more about what observers expected justice to provide in the first place. Was it supposed to explain, to comfort, to align with personal values, or simply to conclude? The case offered no guidance, and in that absence, assumptions were exposed. Some found that their discomfort stemmed from expecting justice to resolve moral uncertainty, a task it was never designed to perform. Others recognized how deeply they equated closure with relief, mistaking finality for meaning. The case unsettled these habits gently but persistently, replacing immediate reaction with prolonged consideration. It showed that when answers are withheld, the mind does not stop working. It works differently. Reflection slowed judgment, widened perspective, and revealed complexity where simplicity had once felt sufficient. The questions raised did not demand solutions. They demanded endurance. In this way, the case moved beyond its legal boundaries and entered a psychological space where resolution was not the goal. Understanding became iterative, incomplete, and personal. And as this internal process took hold, it became clear that the most lasting impact of justice often occurs not when it speaks, but when it leaves room for thought to continue long after its voice has faded. As reflection continued, an unspoken contradiction began to take shape, not as a sudden realization, but as a persistent unease that refused to be ignored. People noticed that they could explain the verdict clearly, repeat the logic behind it, and even defend the process, yet still feel misaligned with the outcome. This was not disagreement, it was dissonance. The case exposed how easily acceptance can coexist with discomfort, and how rarely that coexistence is acknowledged. Individuals found themselves saying the decision made sense while quietly admitting that sense alone did not settle anything. The contradiction lay in the expectation that understanding should feel complete once explanation is achieved. When it did not, frustration followed, directed inward rather than outward. The case highlighted how often people confuse rational agreement with emotional resolution, assuming that clarity of reasoning should naturally produce peace of mind. Instead, the opposite occurred. The more clearly the case was understood, the more visible the gap became between logic and feeling. This gap was unsettling because it resisted categorization. It was not doubt, nor was it dissatisfaction. It was the recognition that justice had fulfilled its function without fulfilling a deeper human expectation that often goes unnamed. As this realization spread quietly, people began to notice similar contradictions elsewhere, in other decisions, other conclusions that felt correct but incomplete. The case had sharpened awareness, making it harder to ignore the mismatch between procedural certainty and internal alignment. What emerged was not criticism of the system, but a recalibration of expectation. Justice was no longer assumed to provide harmony. It was understood to provide structure. Everything beyond that required personal reckoning. This shift did not diminish respect for the verdict. It reframed its role. The decision marked an endpoint for the case, but a starting point for interpretation. Individuals recognize that some forms of discomfort are not signals of error, but signs of complexity. The case did not offer tools to resolve that complexity. It offered permission to acknowledge it. In doing so, it challenged a deeply held assumption that resolution must feel satisfying to be valid. By exposing this assumption, the case opened a space where conflicting responses could exist without needing to be reconciled. Acceptance no longer required emotional alignment. Understanding no longer demanded closure. And in that unresolved space, a more honest engagement with justice began to take form, one that allowed contradiction to exist without forcing it into silence. As the contradiction became clearer, another pattern emerged just as quietly. People avoided naming it, not because they couldn't sense it, but because giving it a name would require confronting what it implied. To articulate the discomfort would mean admitting that justice, while necessary, had not delivered what many unconsciously expected it to deliver. Silence in this context was not confusion, it was protection. By leaving the feeling undefined, individuals preserved the stability that came with accepting the verdict, while postponing the harder work of reconciling it internally. The case revealed how often people choose endurance over articulation, carrying unease privately rather than risking the vulnerability that comes with expressing it. Conversations skirted the edges of the issue, stopping just short of the question that lingered underneath. If everything was decided correctly, why did it still feel unsettled? Naming that question felt risky, as if it might undermine respect for the system or expose a personal failure to accept reality. And so the contradiction remained unspoken, held in the background of thought rather than brought into language. This avoidance was not passive, it was deliberate. People sensed that once articulated, the discomfort would demand response, explanation, or resolution, none of which felt immediately available. The case demonstrated that some tensions persist precisely because they resist easy framing. By remaining unnamed, they retain flexibility, allowing individuals to live with them without forcing premature conclusions. Over time, this strategy became habitual. Discomfort was acknowledged silently, absorbed into daily thinking without interruption. Yet the cost of this avoidance slowly became apparent. Unnamed tensions do not disappear, they diffuse. They influence judgment subtly, shaping reactions without conscious awareness. The case illustrated how silence can carry weight long after words have been withheld. What people avoided saying did not lose significance. It gained it. The absence of language allowed the contradiction to move freely through thought, unchallenged and unresolved. In this way, the case revealed a paradox. Naming discomfort can feel destabilizing, but leaving it unnamed allows it to persist indefinitely. The reluctance to speak did not protect understanding. It deferred it. And in that deferral, the case continued to work quietly, reminding those who carried it that some questions grow heavier not because they are asked too often, but because they are never asked at all. Over time, the unnamed contradiction began to reshape the way people thought, not abruptly, but through a series of small adjustments that accumulated quietly. Decisions were approached with more hesitation, conclusions held with lighter grip, and certainty treated as provisional rather than absolute. The case had introduced a habit of mental caution, a tendency to pause before accepting that an explanation had fully captured what mattered. This pause was not doubt, it was awareness. People noticed themselves asking different questions than before, less focused on whether outcomes were correct and more attentive to how those outcomes would be carried forward. The contradiction, once avoided, became a background influence, guiding thought without demanding acknowledgement. It altered the rhythm of judgment, slowing it just enough to allow complexity to surface. In everyday situations, people found themselves resisting the urge to simplify, recognizing how often simplicity served comfort rather than accuracy. The case had taught them that unresolved tension could be informative, that discomfort might signal depth rather than error. This shift did not make thinking heavier. It made it more deliberate. Opinions were formed with greater care, and when certainty did emerge, It was accompanied by humility. The contradiction no longer felt like something to escape, but something to navigate. As this mindset took hold, individuals realized that their relationship with justice had changed. They no longer expected it to settle everything neatly, and in letting go of that expectation, they found room for a more resilient understanding. The case had quietly recalibrated their sense of finality, replacing closure with continuity. Understanding was no longer something reached and left behind. It became something maintained over time. This evolution revealed that the mind adapts not by resolving every conflict, but by learning how to hold unresolved elements without strain. The contradiction, once carried silently, had become integrated, shaping thought without overwhelming it. In this way, the case extended beyond its original moment, influencing cognition itself. It showed that when questions remain open, thinking does not weaken. It matures. And through that maturation, people discovered that living with complexity did not diminish clarity. It refined it, allowing judgment to remain flexible, attentive, and responsive long after the case itself had formally ended. As this quieter way of thinking settled in, its effects began to surface in ordinary decisions, the small judgments people make without noticing how much they reveal. Choices that once felt automatic now invited a brief pause, not because the stakes were higher, but because the habit of certainty had loosened. People found themselves listening longer, revising opinions mid-thought, and resisting the comfort of immediate conclusions. The case had subtly altered the threshold at which judgment felt justified. Everyday assessments about responsibility, intent, fairness were approached with a softer edge, informed by the recognition that outcomes often conceal as much as they reveal. This did not lead to indecision. It led to calibration. Individuals became more aware of how quickly they once labeled actions as right or wrong, and how rarely they considered what those labels left out. The case had introduced a form of restraint that traveled well beyond the courtroom, shaping interactions in workplaces, families, and private reflection. People noticed they were less interested in winning arguments and more attentive to what arguments overlooked. Disagreement no longer felt like a problem to solve. It felt like information to examine. This shift changed the tone of engagement, replacing urgency with attentiveness. The case demonstrated that when judgment slows, understanding expands. By allowing room for uncertainty, individuals discovered they could respond with greater precision rather than greater force. Small decisions carried more thoughtfulness, not because they demanded it, but because the mind had learned to make space for complexity by default. Over time, this approach reduced the impulse to simplify others into single explanations, recognizing how often behavior resists neat categorization. The case had not taught people to avoid judgment. It had taught them to refine it. In refining judgment, they found that clarity did not disappear. It became more accurate. Certainty, when it arrived, felt earned rather than assumed. The most notable change was not in what people decided, but in how they arrived there. The path to judgment had lengthened just enough to include reflection, and that inclusion altered the quality of the outcome. In this way, the case continued its quiet influence, shaping daily decisions not through instruction, but through a sustained adjustment in how thinking itself unfolded. As judgment slowed, something else quietly expanded: the capacity to notice others without immediately defining them. In conversations, people became less eager to interpret intent and more willing to observe context, recognizing how easily assumptions had once filled the gaps that patience now occupied. The case had not taught empathy directly. It had created the conditions for it by interrupting the rush to conclusion. This interruption changed how disagreements unfolded. Instead of pressing for resolution, individuals allowed space for perspectives to remain incomplete, trusting that understanding could develop without pressure. Relationships absorbed this shift unevenly. Some grew steadier, supported by the absence of instant labels, while others felt exposed, unsettled by the lack of firm positions. The case revealed that empathy does not always feel gentle. Sometimes it feels disorienting because it removes the certainty that once stabilized interaction. People noticed they were listening for longer stretches without planning responses, allowing meaning to arrive rather than be extracted. This patience altered emotional exchange. Responses softened, not out of avoidance, but out of awareness that certainty can flatten complexity. The case demonstrated that empathy deepens when judgment loosens its grip, creating room for nuance to survive. In families, workplaces, and private exchanges, this translated into fewer declarations and more questions, fewer conclusions and more acknowledgments. The absence of immediate judgment did not weaken boundaries. It clarified them. By resisting the urge to decide too quickly, individuals could distinguish between disagreement and misunderstanding, between difference and threat. The case had subtly recalibrated emotional timing, teaching that understanding often arrives after silence rather than during assertion. Over time, this recalibration reshaped expectations of connection. Empathy was no longer equated with agreement, nor was disagreement equated with failure. The space between positions became meaningful, a place where insight could form without demand. In this way, the case extended its influence beyond thought into relationship, demonstrating that when judgment slows, empathy has time to emerge, not as a reaction, but as a practice sustained by attention, restraint, and the willingness to remain present without rushing to resolve what does not yet need resolution. As empathy widened, tolerance for uncertainty began to strengthen, not as a deliberate choice, but as a natural consequence of resisting premature judgment. People discovered that when they no longer rushed to define others, they also became less anxious about not having complete answers. The case had quietly demonstrated that certainty is often used as a shield against discomfort, and when that shield is lowered, uncertainty becomes more manageable rather than more threatening. Individuals noticed they could sit with unanswered questions longer without feeling the need to resolve them immediately. This endurance did not dull curiosity, it refined it. Instead of seeking conclusions to end discomfort, people learned to observe uncertainty as a state worth examining. The case revealed that ambiguity loses much of its power to unsettle when it is approached with patience rather than resistance. As this tolerance grew, reactions softened across situations that once triggered urgency. Decisions were allowed to breathe. Conversations no longer demanded closure to feel complete. The absence of immediate resolution stopped being interpreted as failure and began to feel like an honest reflection of complexity. This shift altered how people related to outcomes beyond the courtroom. They became more willing to accept that some truths unfold gradually, and that forcing clarity can distort understanding. The case illustrated how empathy toward others often translates into patience with uncertainty itself. By acknowledging that experiences cannot always be fully known, individuals found relief in letting questions remain open. Over time, this relief replaced anxiety with steadiness. The mind adjusted to holding partial understanding without strain. Uncertainty became less of a void and more of a space, one where insight could develop without pressure. The case did not remove ambiguity. It changed the relationship to it. In doing so, it revealed that tolerance for uncertainty is not a passive trait, but an active skill cultivated through restraint, attention, and trust in process. As that skill strengthened, people realized that clarity, when it finally arrived, felt more grounded because it had not been forced. And in learning to live with what could not yet be known, they discovered a quieter confidence, one rooted not in certainty, but in the ability to remain open without losing direction. As uncertainty became more familiar, trust began to shift in subtle ways, no longer anchored solely to outcomes but to process itself. People noticed that their confidence in decisions no longer depended on how complete those decisions felt, but on whether the process behind them allowed room for reflection. The case had quietly reframed trust, separating it from the comfort of certainty and reconnecting it to consistency and transparency. This distinction mattered. Trust that depends on emotional satisfaction is fragile. It dissolves when outcomes feel misaligned. Trust grounded in process, however, can endure discomfort without collapsing. The case revealed this difference gradually. Individuals found themselves less shaken by unresolved questions, more willing to accept that trust does not require full understanding at every stage. This acceptance altered how authority was perceived. Respect was no longer equated with agreement, nor was doubt mistaken for disloyalty. Instead, trust became a steady orientation rather than a reaction. The case demonstrated that when people feel permitted to question without consequence, confidence strengthens rather than weakens. Over time, this permission fostered resilience. People no longer needed certainty to feel secure. They needed continuity and honesty, the absence of immediate answers stopped being a threat to trust and became evidence of restraint. The case showed that transparency does not mean explaining everything, but being clear about what can and cannot be resolved. As this understanding took hold, trust matured. It became less reactive, less dependent on closure, and more capable of sustaining ambiguity. Individuals recognize that trust is not blind acceptance, but informed patience. The case did not demand belief. It invited engagement. By allowing space for uncertainty, it preserved credibility where forced certainty might have eroded it. In this way, trust evolved from expectation into alignment, grounded not in the promise of satisfaction, but in the reliability of process over time. The most enduring lesson was not about faith in outcomes, but about confidence in systems that acknowledge their own limits, demonstrating that trust does not require silence, only honesty about where answers end and responsibility begins. With trust no longer tied to certainty, people began to recognize a quieter shift taking place beneath the surface of their thinking, one that changed not what they believed, but how firmly they felt the need to believe it. The case had loosened something that once felt fixed. Opinions were still formed, values still held, but they no longer demanded immediate defense. This shift was subtle, almost easy to miss, yet it altered the internal posture with which individuals approached judgment itself. People became less concerned with arriving at the right conclusion and more attentive to how conclusions were reached and carried forward. The case revealed that confidence does not have to announce itself loudly to be real. In fact, the absence of urgency often signaled deeper assurance. Individuals noticed they were no longer unsettled by alternative interpretations, nor did they feel compelled to resolve disagreement quickly. Instead, they allowed perspectives to coexist, trusting that understanding did not require dominance. This was not indifference, it was composure. The case had demonstrated that certainty, when overused, can become brittle, breaking under pressure, while flexibility allows beliefs to adapt without losing coherence. Over time, this composure reshaped internal dialogue. Self-questioning no longer felt threatening. It felt responsible. People discovered that revisiting their own assumptions did not weaken conviction, but refined it. The case offered a rare example of how restraint can strengthen clarity rather than obscure it. By resisting the urge to finalize meaning too quickly, individuals maintained a living relationship with their own values. This relationship was dynamic, responsive to new context, and resilient in the face of ambiguity. The case showed that when belief is allowed to remain open, it does not dissolve. It matures. Judgment became less about asserting position, and more about sustaining alignment between thought and experience. In this way, the case continued its quiet influence, not by changing what people believed, but by changing how tightly they held those beliefs. What emerged was not uncertainty, but balance, a steadiness grounded in the understanding that meaning does not have to be fixed to be reliable, and that the strength of judgment often lies in its willingness to remain attentive rather than absolute. As this quieter balance settled in, the idea of justice itself began to shift in meaning, no longer viewed as a moment of resolution, but as a reference point that shaped future judgment. People noticed that they stopped asking whether the case had been handled correctly and started asking a different question altogether. What did this outcome teach them about how justice actually works in practice? The case became less about its specific details and more about the expectations it quietly dismantled. It revealed that justice is often imagined as a final chapter, when in reality it functions more like a margin note, influencing interpretation without dictating conclusion. This realization reframed how individuals approached other decisions that followed. Instead of looking for closure, they looked for coherence. Instead of demanding answers, they examined consistency. The case had shown that justice does not guarantee satisfaction, but it can provide structure strong enough to hold unresolved meaning without collapsing under it. Over time, this understanding reduced frustration. People became less inclined to treat discomfort as a sign of failure and more willing to accept it as part of engagement. Justice was no longer burdened with the task of emotional resolution. It was recognized as a system designed to draw boundaries, not to fill emotional gaps. This distinction brought clarity without comfort, and strangely, that clarity felt more honest. The case demonstrated that when justice is relieved of expectations it was never meant to meet, trust becomes steadier rather than conditional. Individuals learn to respect outcomes without requiring them to explain everything. This did not produce detachment, it produced realism. Justice became something to work with, not something to believe in blindly. The absence of final answers stopped feeling like a flaw and began to feel like an acknowledgement of limits. In recognizing those limits, people found that their engagement with justice deepened rather than weakened. They no longer looked to it for emotional alignment, but for reliable process. And within that process, they discovered space to think, to question, and to carry forward meaning without demanding that it be resolved all at once. The case no longer represented an ending. It became a lens, quietly reshaping how justice was understood long after the decision itself had faded into record. As time placed more distance between the verdict and everyday life, the case began to change form again, no longer functioning as a shared reference, but as a personal memory shaped differently by each individual who carried it. What remained was not a clear sequence of events, but fragments colored by emotion, expectation, and later experience. Some remembered the calm efficiency of the process, others recalled the discomfort that followed, and many found that what stayed with them had little to do with the legal details at all. The case demonstrated how justice, once absorbed into memory, stops being objective and becomes interpretive. It is remembered not as it was delivered, but as it was lived. This shift revealed how meaning evolves independently of record. Official outcomes remain fixed, but personal understanding continues to move. Over time, people noticed that their recollection of the case aligned, less with what happened and more with what it represented at different stages of their lives. As priorities changed, so did the weight they assigned to the decision. What once felt unresolved later felt instructive. What once felt unsettling eventually felt familiar. The case became a quiet marker in personal history, referenced internally during moments of judgment, hesitation, or reassessment. It no longer demanded attention, but it influenced orientation. Memory did not preserve the case intact, it integrated it. In doing so, it softened edges without erasing significance. The case showed that justice, once internalized, does not disappear when it fades from public discussion. It continues to operate through recollection, shaping instinct more than opinion. People realized that their response to new situations was often informed by lessons they never consciously extracted. The case had become part of how they understood fairness itself, not as a rule, but as an experience. This transformation underscored a subtle truth. Justice does not live permanently in institutions or outcomes, but in memory, where it is reshaped continuously by context and reflection. In that space, meaning is not finalized. It is revisited. The case endured not because it demanded to be remembered, but because it had become inseparable from how people learned to think about judgment, responsibility, and the limits of resolution over time. As the case settled deeper into personal memory, it began to drift quietly away from the collective narrative that had once framed it. revealing how justice, over time, can lose its public shape while retaining private influence. Public references faded first. The case was no longer cited in discussions or used as an example in broader conversations. It stopped functioning as a shared point of orientation and instead became something internal, accessed only when individual experience called it forward. This separation marked an important shift. When justice lives in public narrative, it is shaped by consensus, language, and repetition. When it moves into personal memory, it becomes insulated from those forces, free to evolve without coordination. The case demonstrated how meaning can fracture not through disagreement, but through quiet divergence. Each person carried a version of the outcome that made sense within their own context, shaped by later events, values, and reflection. Without a common retelling to anchor interpretation, the case lost its collective coherence. This did not diminish its importance. It redistributed it. Justice was no longer something people referenced together, but something they carried separately. Over time, this separation altered how individuals understood social agreement itself. They recognized that shared conclusions often depend less on truth than on proximity and repetition. Once distance intervenes, consensus weakens, and interpretation takes its place. The case illustrated how easily public meaning dissolves when it is no longer actively maintained, leaving behind a constellation of personal understandings that do not easily align. This divergence did not produce conflict because it remained largely invisible. People rarely compared their internal versions of the case. They simply operated from them. In this way, justice became individualized without announcement. Its influence persisted, but without the structure of collective interpretation. The case revealed that when justice leaves the public sphere, it does not vanish. It decentralizes. Meaning becomes portable, flexible, and personal. This decentralization carried implications. It showed that society often assumes shared understanding where none exists, relying on silence as evidence of agreement. The case challenged that assumption quietly, demonstrating that the absence of discussion does not signal unity, but distance. Justice had not failed to unify. It had completed its role and moved on, leaving individuals to integrate its impact independently. And in that quiet dispersion, the case exposed how easily collective narratives dissolve, while personal meanings continue to shape. Judgment long after public attention has moved elsewhere. Once the case fully detached from public conversation, justice was left alone with individual conscience, no longer reinforced by shared language or collective agreement. In this quieter space, people noticed that their relationship with the outcome changed again, becoming more intimate and, at times, more demanding. Without a common narrative to lean on, each person had to decide how much weight the case still carried and what it meant for their own sense of responsibility. Justice no longer arrived as an external reference point. It emerged internally, shaped by personal values rather than public consensus. This shift revealed how much moral certainty often depends on social reinforcement. When that reinforcement disappears, conscience becomes more active. Individuals found themselves revisiting the case not to reassess the verdict, but to reassess themselves. Questions surfaced that had nothing to do with legality and everything to do with alignment. How comfortable was I with this outcome? What did it ask of me now that no one else was watching? The absence of public attention removed performance from judgment. There was no audience, no expectation of agreement, only an internal reckoning that could not be delegated. The case demonstrated that conscience does not seek resolution in the same way institutions do. It does not close files or mark conclusions. It revisits, reconsiders, and reweights meaning over time. This ongoing engagement was not dramatic. It did not produce guilt or outrage. It produced attentiveness. People became more aware of how their principles operated when no validation followed. Justice, in this context, became less about correctness and more about integrity. The case showed that when collective judgment dissolves, personal accountability becomes clearer rather than weaker. Without shared interpretation to absorb discomfort, Individuals had to decide what to carry forward and what to let rest. This decision-making did not demand certainty. It demanded honesty. Over time, conscience absorbed the case not as a lesson, but as a reference, a quiet standard against which future judgments were measured. Justice no longer functioned as a conclusion reached together, but as a responsibility held alone. And in that solitude, the case revealed one of its most enduring truths. When justice leaves the public stage, it does not disappear. It waits, patiently, for each individual to decide what it means to live with it. As time passed, individual conscience began to negotiate with the weight it had inherited, not by resolving it, but by learning how to live alongside it without strain. What once felt heavy gradually became familiar, not because its significance diminished, but because the mind adapted to carrying it with greater balance. People noticed that the case no longer surfaced with urgency, but with context, appearing during moments that required judgment rather than moments that demanded reaction. This change revealed how conscience transforms pressure into orientation over time. The case had not imposed a burden meant to be endured indefinitely. It had offered a reference meant to be integrated. Individuals learned that holding unresolved meaning does not require constant attention, only availability. The conscience did not ask for answers. It asked for alignment. Over time, this alignment became easier to maintain as expectations softened. People stopped waiting for the case to settle emotionally and accepted that some matters remain open without destabilizing daily life. This acceptance was not resignation. It was calibration. The case demonstrated that when conscience is allowed to evolve naturally, tension gives way to clarity of stance rather than clarity of explanation. Individuals became more confident in their ability to act without needing complete resolution behind every choice. The presence of the case within conscience no longer disrupted decision-making. It informed it quietly. This transformation showed that moral weight does not disappear through resolution, but through accommodation. The mind makes room for what cannot be, closed by placing it where it can be consulted, rather than carried constantly. In doing so, the case ceased to feel like an unfinished task and became part of an internal framework that guided behavior without demanding justification. Justice, filtered through time and conscience, no longer felt incomplete. It felt contextual. The absence of final answers stopped being a source of friction and became a sign of realism. People recognized that living with justice does not mean achieving emotional closure, but sustaining ethical awareness without fatigue. In this way, the case completed another transformation, not by ending, but by settling into conscience as a quiet companion to judgment, present when needed, silent when not, shaping action without insisting on resolution, and demonstrating that some meanings are not meant to be solved, only carried well. As this internal reconciliation settled into place, its effects began to surface quietly in behavior, revealing how unresolved meaning can shape choices without announcing itself. People noticed subtle shifts in how they acted under pressure, how they responded when outcomes were unclear, and how willing they were to proceed without complete assurance. Decisions became less performative and more grounded, guided by an internal consistency rather than external validation. The case had taught them that action does not require certainty, only coherence between values and circumstance. This understanding reduced hesitation without restoring rigidity. Individuals became more comfortable making decisions that acknowledged limits, accepting that some actions are taken not because all questions are answered, but because waiting for answers is not always possible. The influence of the case appeared most clearly in moments that offered no clear guidance, when responsibility could not be deferred to rules or precedent. In those moments, people relied on the internal framework that had quietly formed, one shaped by patience, restraint, and awareness of complexity. The case did not provide instructions. It refined judgment. Behavior reflected this refinement through moderation rather than caution, decisiveness tempered by openness to revision. People found they could act and still remain receptive, committed without becoming inflexible. This balance altered how mistakes were perceived. Errors no longer felt like evidence of failure, but as part of engagement with imperfect information. The case had normalized acting under uncertainty, without treating uncertainty as a flaw. Over time, this perspective fostered resilience. Individuals were less disrupted by ambiguity and less dependent on reassurance after making choices. They trusted their process even when outcomes remained unresolved. This trust did not eliminate doubt. It placed it alongside responsibility rather than against it. The case demonstrated that ethical behavior does not emerge from clarity alone, but from the ability to move forward while remaining attentive to what is unresolved. In this way, justice extended beyond decision and memory into action itself, shaping how people chose to participate in situations that resisted neat resolution. The most significant change was not in what people did, but in how they justified doing it. Justification shifted inward, measured against conscience rather than conclusion. And through that shift, the case revealed its enduring impact, not as a lesson remembered, but as a way of acting that remained steady even when answers did not arrive. As behavior adjusted to this quieter balance, identity itself began to shift in ways that were subtle yet enduring, altering how individuals understood who they were when certainty was absent. People noticed that their sense of self was no longer tied to having firm answers, but to how they navigated situations where answers were incomplete. The case had quietly redefined strength, moving it away from decisiveness toward steadiness. Identity became less about holding correct positions and more about sustaining integrity across changing circumstances. This shift did not happen through reflection alone. It emerged through repeated choices made without full clarity, each reinforcing the idea that consistency of values mattered more than certainty of outcome. Individuals found that they were less reactive to challenges to their views, less threatened by disagreement, and more confident in their ability to remain grounded without needing to defend every belief. The case revealed that identity does not require rigidity to remain coherent. In fact, flexibility became a marker of alignment rather than confusion. Over time, people recognized that their internal narrative had changed. They no longer described themselves as certain or decisive, but as attentive, measured, and capable of holding complexity without losing direction. This reframing altered how they related to authority, conflict, and responsibility. Identity became something practiced rather than asserted. The case demonstrated that when individuals stop relying on external resolution to validate who they are, self-understanding deepens. Values were no longer proven through outcomes, but through continuity of behavior. This continuity provided a quiet confidence that did not depend on agreement or affirmation. The case had not removed uncertainty from identity. It had normalized it. In doing so, it freed people from the pressure to appear resolved when they were not. Identity became more honest, less performative, and more resilient. The absence of final answers stopped feeling like a threat to self-definition and began to feel like an invitation to remain engaged. Through this transformation, the case revealed that identity shaped by justice is not forged in moments of resolution, but in the sustained ability to act, reflect, and adapt without demanding that every question be settled before moving forward. As identity stabilized around this new sense of steadiness, people began to notice a change in how they related to authority itself, not with resistance or surrender, but with measured distance. The case had taught them that respect does not require emotional alignment, and that disagreement does not automatically signal rejection. This distinction altered the way authority was perceived across situations that extended far beyond the original outcome. Individuals no longer felt compelled to accept conclusions as personal affirmations, nor did they feel threatened when outcomes conflicted with their internal sense of meaning. Authority became something to engage with rather than internalize. The case revealed that when people stop expecting external systems to validate their values, they gain the freedom to assess authority without defensiveness. This freedom did not weaken structure. It clarified boundaries. People could acknowledge legitimacy without surrendering interpretation. They could follow decisions without absorbing them as identity. Over time, this posture reduced internal friction. Individuals found that they could cooperate without compliance and question without hostility. The case demonstrated that authority functions best when it is neither idealized nor personalized. By placing justice at an appropriate distance, people preserved both trust and autonomy. This balance shifted expectations. Authority was no longer expected to explain itself emotionally, only to operate consistently. When it did so, respect followed naturally, even in the presence of unresolved questions. The case showed that much of the tension between individuals and systems arises from misplaced expectations rather than failure. Once those expectations were recalibrated, engagement became calmer and more sustainable. People learned to separate the legitimacy of a process from the meaning they personally derived from its outcomes. This separation allowed authority to exist without occupying internal space it was never meant to fill. In this way, the case refined how power and responsibility were understood, not as forces that define identity, but as structures that individuals navigate while maintaining internal coherence. The most significant change was subtle. Authority lost its emotional weight without losing its functional importance, and in that lightened relationship, people discovered a form of respect that did not demand agreement, only recognition of limits and roles within a shared framework. As this recalibrated relationship with authority spread quietly, its effects began to register at a broader level, influencing how people understood trust within shared life, rather than within individual judgment alone. Social confidence no longer relied on unanimous agreement or emotional alignment. It rested on the expectation that systems would act consistently while individuals retained the freedom to interpret outcomes personally. The case had shown that collective stability does not require collective certainty. What it requires is predictability of process and tolerance of difference. People noticed that conversations about fairness became less polarized when agreement was no longer treated as a prerequisite for cohesion. Discomfort did not automatically translate into division. The case revealed that when individuals feel less pressured to internalize authority, they become more capable of coexisting within it. This shift reduced the urgency to persuade, correct, or dominate interpretation. Instead, space opened for parallel understandings to exist without threatening shared structure. Trust in society became less emotional and more functional, grounded in the belief that disagreement could persist without destabilizing cooperation. The case illustrated how public confidence strengthens when expectations are realistic. People stopped asking institutions to deliver meaning and began asking them to deliver reliability. This change clarified roles on both sides. Systems were judged by consistency and transparency, while individuals accepted responsibility for interpretation and response. Over time, this separation eased tension. Social bonds became less fragile because they were no longer dependent on shared conclusions. The case demonstrated that unity does not require sameness, only mutual recognition of boundaries. As this understanding took hold, collective life felt steadier, not because questions disappeared, but because their presence no longer threatened participation. People learned to live alongside unresolved issues without treating them as faults in the system or in one another. Trust became quieter and more durable, less reactive to outcomes and more resilient to uncertainty. In this way, the case extended its influence beyond individual conscience into the fabric of shared experience, revealing that social confidence grows not from the elimination of doubt, but from the ability to accommodate it without fracture. The most enduring impact was subtle yet profound. A shift from demanding emotional consensus to sustaining functional coexistence, where justice provided structure in society, learned how to live within it without insisting that every question be answered. Before moving forward, as this new social balance settled in, it gradually became ordinary, so integrated into daily expectations that it stopped being noticed as a change at all. People adjusted without marking the moment, adopting calmer assumptions about disagreement, authority, and uncertainty as if they had always been that way. What once felt like an intentional recalibration faded into habit. The case revealed how quickly stability can become invisible once it functions reliably. Individuals no longer reflected on why. Conversations felt less volatile or why unresolved questions no longer produced immediate tension. They simply accepted the shift as normal. This normalization carried both relief and risk. On one hand, it allowed shared life to proceed without constant strain. On the other, it obscured the effort that had made the balance possible. The case demonstrated that when adaptation succeeds, it often erases its own origin. People stopped recognizing tolerance for ambiguity as a learned skill and began treating it as a baseline expectation. This made it easier to maintain, but harder to protect. Without conscious awareness, habits can drift. The calm that followed no longer invited reflection. It assumed continuity. The case illustrated how systems of understanding can stabilize quietly while becoming vulnerable to neglect. When balance is no longer examined, it can be taken for granted. Individuals noticed that they were less inclined to revisit assumptions that had once required careful negotiation. The absence of friction was interpreted as proof of alignment rather than as a condition, sustained through restraint. Over time, this invisibility reduced attentiveness. The case did not suggest that stability was false, only that it was fragile when unacknowledged. The very success of the adjustment made it harder to remember why it mattered. Justice continued to function within this normalized space, but its influence blended into routine expectations. People lived with uncertainty competently, yet without conscious recognition of how that competence had been earned. In this way, the case revealed a paradox. The more smoothly a balance operates, the less visible it becomes, and the less visible it becomes, the more easily it can erode. The story did not warn of collapse. It highlighted a quiet responsibility to notice what feels normal, to remember how it came to be, and to remain attentive even when stability no longer demands attention. Because what is no longer questioned is not necessarily secure, only familiar. The moment this quiet balance began to be questioned, again did not arrive through conflict or crisis, but through subtle friction, the kind that appears when routines stop aligning perfectly with experience. People sensed it in small inconsistencies, when familiar assumptions no longer fit new situations as smoothly as before. The case, long absorbed into normality, resurfaced indirectly as a reference point for reassessment rather than debate. Individuals noticed that what once felt sufficient now felt incomplete, not because the balance had failed, but because circumstances had shifted. This realization marked the return of inquiry, not as opposition, but as maintenance. The case revealed that stability does not eliminate the need for examination. It postpones it. When conditions change, previously settled arrangements must be revisited to remain relevant. People began to ask quieter questions again, not about outcomes, but about adequacy. Is this still working? Does this assumption still hold? The absence of immediate disruption allowed these questions to form without urgency, creating space for thoughtful reconsideration. The case demonstrated that healthy systems invite periodic questioning without requiring collapse to justify it. This renewed inquiry did not dismantle trust. It refreshed it. Individuals recognize that questioning is not a threat to balance, but a condition of its survival. The case had taught them how to live with unresolved meaning. Now it reminded them how to revisit it responsibly. Reflection returned not as doubt, but as calibration. People adjusted expectations incrementally, refining rather than rejecting what had become familiar. This process revealed how normalization and questioning are not opposites, but phases within the same cycle. Stability emerges, settles, and eventually invites reassessment to remain functional. The case illustrated that when reassessment is delayed too long, balance becomes rigid. When it arrives too quickly, balance never forms. The quiet return of questioning signaled maturity rather than instability. It showed that understanding evolves not through dramatic reversal, but through attentive adjustment. In this way, the case completed another turn in its long influence, moving from conclusion to habit and back to consideration. Justice remained intact, but meaning shifted again, responding to new context without erasing what had come before. The questions that returned were not louder than before. They were clearer, and in their clarity they demonstrated that stability is not preserved by silence, but by the willingness to examine what feels. Settled before, it quietly stops, serving its purpose. As questioning resumed, it became clear that it did not surface uniformly, but split along two distinct paths, one inward and one outward, each shaping understanding in different ways. On a personal level, individuals revisited assumptions privately, adjusting how they interpreted responsibility, fairness, and consequence within their own lives. These reflections were quiet and iterative, less concerned with conclusions than with alignment. People asked themselves whether the balance they had accepted still reflected their values, and if not, where adjustment was needed. At the same time, a parallel movement unfolded socially, though far less visibly. In shared spaces, the renewed questioning appeared not as debate, but as subtle shifts in tone, a greater tolerance for disagreement, and a reluctance to reduce complex issues to single explanations. The case revealed that collective reassessment rarely announces itself. It diffuses through language, pacing, and restraint. Individuals carried their private recalibrations into public interaction without naming them, resulting in a social environment that felt more flexible without appearing unsettled. This divergence mattered. Personal inquiry deepened interpretation, while social inquiry moderated expression. The two did not compete. They complemented one another. The case demonstrated that when individual reflection outpaces public articulation, stability can be preserved while understanding evolves. People learned to hold different stages of clarity simultaneously, allowing personal insight to mature before demanding collective agreement. This approach reduced friction. Disagreement no longer felt urgent to resolve because its presence did not threaten participation. The case showed that mature questioning does not insist on synchronization. It allows individuals to arrive at understanding at different times without forcing convergence. Over time, this asynchronous inquiry strengthened both personal integrity and social cohesion. Individuals felt less pressure to align prematurely, and shared life felt less fragile as a result. The case illustrated that when questioning is permitted to take multiple forms, it becomes less disruptive and more productive. Internal reassessment sharpened values, while external moderation preserved cooperation. Together, they created a dynamic equilibrium, one capable of adapting without destabilizing. In this way, the renewed inquiry did not fracture meaning. It diversified it, allowing justice to remain a common structure while interpretation continued to evolve along parallel paths. The most significant outcome was not agreement, but durability, a shared capacity to sustain difference without turning it into division. As this layered questioning continued, it did not accelerate or intensify. Instead, it slowed, gaining depth rather than momentum. What once resurfaced as periodic reassessment became a steadier, more deliberate rhythm of thought. People noticed that their questions no longer demanded immediate engagement. They were carried forward, revisited when circumstances required, and set aside when they did not. This shift marked an important transition. Inquiry moved from reaction to orientation. The case had taught individuals how to question without urgency, allowing understanding to accumulate over time rather than be forced into resolution. This slower pace changed the quality of reflection. Questions became fewer but more precise. Instead of circling broad uncertainties, people focused on how specific assumptions held up under new conditions. The absence of haste reduced defensiveness. There was no pressure to arrive at conclusions quickly, no expectation that clarity must follow immediately. The case demonstrated that depth often emerges when inquiry is allowed to rest. By giving questions time, individuals could distinguish between what truly required reconsideration and what merely reflected temporary discomfort. This discernment strengthened judgment. Reflection became more selective, guided by relevance rather than impulse. On a social level, this slowing had a calming effect. Conversations felt less charged, not because issues were avoided, but because they were approached with proportion. The case illustrated that when questioning matures, it loses its disruptive edge and becomes a stabilizing force. People learned that not every uncertainty requires attention at the same time. Some questions belong to later stages of understanding. Others resolve themselves as context evolves. This patience reshaped expectations. Individuals no longer measured insight by speed, but by coherence over time. The case had quietly reframed what it meant to think responsibly. Responsibility was no longer equated with constant engagement, but with knowing when to engage and when to allow perspective to develop on its own. In this slower mode, reflection felt less exhausting and more sustainable. The questions that remained did not weigh heavily. They oriented attention without demanding resolution. And through this deceleration, the case revealed a final transformation of inquiry itself, from something that interrupts life into something that accompanies it, present but not intrusive, shaping understanding through continuity rather than pressure, and demonstrating that the deepest forms of questioning do not rush toward answers, but wait for the moment when answers, if they arrive at all, can be integrated without force. At a certain point, it became clear that not every question raised by the case was meant to be resolved, and that this was not a failure of justice, but a feature of it. The slow, deliberate inquiry that had followed the verdict did not lead toward a final revelation or a hidden truth waiting to be uncovered. Instead, it led toward acceptance of limits. People recognize that some questions persist not because they lack answers, but because answering them would require something justice was never designed to provide. The case revealed that resolution is not the same as understanding, and that understanding does not always arrive through conclusion. By allowing certain questions to remain open, justice preserved its role without overreaching into areas it could not responsibly occupy. This realization reframed the discomfort that had followed the verdict from the beginning. What once felt unfinished now felt intentional. The absence of closure was no longer interpreted as neglect, but as restraint. People understood that justice does not exist to quiet every doubt or to satisfy every expectation placed upon it. Its responsibility ends where personal meaning begins. The case had drawn that boundary clearly, even if it took time for it to be recognized. In doing so, it offered something more durable than answers: orientation. Individuals learned how to live alongside unresolved meaning, without being consumed by it, how to act responsibly without demanding certainty, and how to think deeply without insisting on finality. The questions that remained no longer pressed for resolution. They served as reminders of complexity, humility, and the limits of systems built to decide rather than to explain. The case did not conclude with clarity, but with perspective. Justice had ended the case exactly where it was meant to end it. Everything that followed belonged elsewhere, in conscience, in memory, and in the ongoing effort to align action with values in a world where not every question can or should be answered. And in that recognition, the story found its quiet ending. Not by closing every door, but by leaving one open deliberately, acknowledging that some questions are not meant to disappear, only to be carried with awareness rather than urgency.